When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, waiting for you. User, Sident5. Posted, August 18th, 1995.
My grandparents used to live in a nice little World War II era house that sat on the corner of a busy intersection in Branson, Missouri. It was white with a concrete veranda facing toward the road that got hit a good 3 or 4 times over the years by speeding cars that missed the turn. I was alive for the last hit, and man, if you've never heard a car smash full-on into a concrete wall at speed, you have no idea what loud really is. The driver survived, which was great for him and for me. Just seeing the accident was bad enough without also having to watch a man die. My grandma died of pneumonia in '88, leaving my grandfather to fend for himself. He was an old-school kind of guy, which is code for pays the bills but is incapable of managing a household, and so my sister Mimi spent a lot of time over there keeping up the house. After about a year, Mimi called a family meeting and said she couldn't keep the pace up anymore. That between looking after Grandpa and his house, plus her full-time job, she was at her wit's end. She also had noticed some cognitive decline in Grandpa during her visits and was worried he might end up hurting himself or someone else if left alone for too long. After a lot of soul-searching and some hard conversations with him, we all decided together it was best if he moved into an assisted living facility. I've got to say that I have so much respect for how he handled those conversations. He had no idea how bad his non-lucid episodes had become and completely supported his moving. My grandfather was and remains a real gentleman, and I hope to God that when my time comes, I can conduct myself even half as honorably as he has. After the decision was made, he called his lawyer and had him draw up all the necessary paperwork to transfer ownership of his assets into a trust for the family. He said this would make the process of emptying and selling the house easier for us, as well as lessen the financial burden down the road when he finally left us. It took another month to find an appropriate facility and get him moved in, and he took to it about as well as anyone could hope for. I could tell it wasn't the same for him as living at home, but it was the best arrangement possible under the circumstances. After the house was cleared out, we sold it to a local couple named Beth and Gary. Gary and I had gone to high school together, and they'd just moved back from Springfield to start a family. Maybe 2 weeks after they moved in, Gary came to see me at the hardware store. Now, Gary might be a Democrat, but he's not a nut, so when he asked me if anything weird had ever happened in Grandpa's house, I had no idea he meant ghosts. I said that the upstairs windows were new and the roof had been replaced in '89, so if any of it were leaking, he'd want to speak to the people who'd done the work, but he waved me off. The house was fine, he said, but his wife had had some trouble. never forget the way he said it. Trouble, like her car wouldn't start or something. I asked what kind of trouble, and he looked at the floor for a minute and said she'd been seeing a woman in the bedroom every night since they moved in. Hats off to Gary. No man had ever rendered me speechless before, but that did it. I just stared at him while he drew himself up and went on. Each time, he said, it started with the bedroom door slamming. Not the sound of it slamming, but actual slamming, so hard you could hear the knob rattle. He was a deep sleeper, he said, so he didn't ever hear it, but it always woke Beth right up. Once she was up, she saw a woman about her age walk from the doorway to the foot of her bed. According to Beth, the woman looked sad and confused before fading away. Like I said before, I didn't know how to respond to Gary, except to say that this had never come up before, but I'd ask around and see if maybe Mimi or someone else had something to offer. I called Mimi after work, and of course she was excited. She is definitely a ghost person and wanted to know more. I gave her Beth and Gary's number and told her to have at it. A week later, she called me, and this is what she said. After my call, she got a hold of Beth and invited her over to the house for coffee. She asked her to describe the woman she'd been seeing, and then Mimi brought out a photo album. Being into ghost and spooky stuff, I guess she had some ideas of how this was going to go. She asked Beth to leaf through the album and see if anyone in there looked familiar. Sure enough, a few pages in, Beth drew a sharp breath and said her. Her was my grandmother, of course, and I suppose I should have seen it coming. What makes it even more unusual, though, is that the photo she'd pointed out wasn't my granny as she died, but her as a young woman. Whatever doubts I might have had about this being some kind of fancy cooked up by Beth and Gary for whatever reason went away, because she might have known what Granny looked like at the end, but there was no way she could have guessed how she looked 60 years before. I guess Mimi told Beth that the next night my grandmother appeared, she should tell her that we had helped Norm, my grandpa, move somewhere he could be looked after properly. Well, when she did, my grandmother's ghost had, according to Beth, given her a warm smile before fading away. To the best of my knowledge, she's yet to return. Sometimes I wonder if she visits my grandfather up at the home, but never asked. The moments where he's really him are fewer and more far between these days, and I feel like when we do have time together, it's not my place to pry, but I do feel better knowing she'll be there to receive him when he finally crosses over.
Subject, yellow cake. User, ToughTake6398. Posted, February 2nd, 1994.
Have you ever heard of COG? It stands for Continuity of Government. What it is a plan that all the bigwigs put in place so that if the Russians, or whoever comes after the Russians, I guess now that they're gone, ever nukes us, there'll still be someone left to run the show. As for what happens to the rest of us, well, try not to think about it. The actual plans are kept under wraps, but because of what I do for a living, the specifics of which I cannot get into, I know that there are 2 huge underground facilities within an hour's drive of DC. In the event of the unthinkable, it is in those places where a hand-picked group of government figures and their support staff will be taken and, if necessary, kept for the duration of whatever the event happens to be. One of the facilities is Raven Rock, or Site R, in southern Pennsylvania, next to the Maryland state line. Above ground, it's 650 surface acres, and below ground, you've got around 600,000 square feet worth of elbow room, all serviced by Fort Ritchie just down the road. The facility I've actually been inside is the other, Mount Weather in Virginia. Mount Weather is, I'm told, a little smaller than Site R, but it's still over 500,000 square feet. Imagine the Pontiac Silverdome, but 25% bigger and underground. It's got its own hospital, crematorium, meal and rec areas, 20 office buildings, and cots for 2,000 people with private quarters for the president, his cabinet, and the Supreme Court. It's got more than 500,000 gallons of clean drinking water, a power plant, plus lots of other goodies I can't tell you about. And it's all protected by a 10-foot-tall, 20-foot-wide blast door that weighs 34 tons and takes forever to open. But you know what the blast door can't keep out? What we have never been able to actually find, let alone remove? Whatever the hell lived in the mountain before we started tunneling in the 50s. Because let me tell you, they are in there, and they are pissed. The first time we encountered them was our first time on site. My team was there to perform routine maintenance across a number of systems. We were individually escorted to our work sites and then left to our devices. Maybe half an hour after I got into it, my co-worker, who we'll call Greg, left his post in water treatment and came to find me, complaining about a burning feeling in his side. He eats like crap and never exercises, so I figured it was incoming shingles or something, but when I pulled up his work shirt to take a look, I saw 3 ugly purple furrows like scratch marks running from just under his armpit to his waist. I thought maybe his girlfriend Wendy had taken a run at him before work, but he said she hadn't and that the burning had only started after his escort had left and had gotten down to work. Those scratches took weeks to heal. So long that I encouraged him to get blood work done to make sure there wasn't something suppressing his immune system. On our next visit, it was our electrician Randy who had trouble. He was working in one of the adjacent tunnels where the office buildings are when he stepped away from what he was doing to go take a leak. After he finished, he said the bathroom door wouldn't open. It was a shared bathroom with multiple stalls, so the door didn't have a deadbolt, but he said it felt like it was locked tight. He pulled on the thing so hard he thought his shoulder was gonna pop, but it would not budge. As he was standing there trying to figure out what the hell was going on, the overhead lights went out. Now, you might get used to being underground for long periods of time, but being underground in the dark, we got a name for that, and it's a permanent one. Randy tried not to panic and was doing okay until he felt someone breathe on his neck. He thought maybe someone else had been trapped in there with him, so he tried saying hello, but no one responded. Randy told me he had started to turn around when he heard a crashing sound from the hallway on the other side of the door, like a tornado made of metal had started bashing into things. He froze in place, the door at his back. Then the breath started on his face. He said it was warm, but smelled like dirt and mold. A second later, the light was back on, and he was alone in there. The door, when he tried it again, opened like nothing. His workstation, though, was a horror show. It looked like someone had put a bomb in his toolbox. A couple of the screwdrivers were actually embedded in the wall across the room. He came to find me, and we brought it up to security, who took it way too easy. They didn't bat an eye and just said, "We'll handle it, move on to your next assignment, and don't leave outside metal unattended. If you need the bathroom again, call us and we'll have someone escort you." None of our follow-up questions were answered, and you can guess we had a few. The next time, though, the security supervisor called me into his office as soon as we arrived. He referenced the incident on our last maintenance visit and said I could do one of two things. Either my team could have constant supervision, which we both knew would be a time-consuming pain in the ass for all involved, or I could do something but not ask any further questions about it. That got my interest, but of course I had, questions. The soup just shook his head and said to choose. Since I didn't want to have someone breathing down my neck the entire workday, I said I'd take the other thing. He raised his eyebrow and asked if I was sure because he was genuinely not going to answer any questions I might ask. I said I was. He stood up and led me out of his office into the central administrative lobby, right to a stack of Tupperware containers on a long table. He opened one and showed me. Stacked inside was maybe 3 dozen 3-inch by 3-inch pieces of what looked like yellow cake. He counted out as many pieces of cake as we had members of my team, wrapped them in its own paper napkin, and handed them to me. "Give one of these to each of your team members and tell them to set it a few feet behind them when they start to work. Tell them that no matter what they hear, they are not to turn around. You can go now." I didn't move. Instead, I stared at the cake. "Is this?" I said. The security supervisor stopped me. "No questions, son. It's just saffron cake. Nothing to worry about. Just tell your boys that they need to do this every time they come here and every time they move to a new area. You'll be fine. Hell, feel free to eat some if you like. Just don't forget to leave some too." You can imagine the response I got coming back with a handful of cake and instructions like that, but we did exactly what he said and didn't have any issues on that maintenance visit. That was not the end of our experiences in Mount Weather, however, but that's a story for another time.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.